So we got this form in our HTML file. And that's a standard HTML form using standard HTML form elements. I have this button, and it looks like if I click this button that this form is submitted then. Because if I enter anything here, we see that it's cleared thereafter, and that data ends up in the URL. Now indeed, the page did reload. Whenever I click send, the page reloads, as you can tell by the flashing refresh icon if you watch closely. Now that's the default browser behavior. The default behavior we get when we add a form to a page and we have a button in the form that submits it. Now, a button by default submits a form if placed inside of it, unless you give it a type of button. The default is type submit, and therefore you don't need to add this type unless you want to be very explicit about the fact that this will be the submitting button. But if we would set this button to type button, then if we save this and reload, you will notice that if I clear this URL manually, if I now click send, the page does not reload and we don't have this question mark thing appended to the URL, because now this button is no longer submitting the form. But of course we do want this button to submit the form. We want to use this button to take the user input and then do something with it, although we can't exactly tell yet what something is here. But still, let's turn it back to type submit, which, as I said, you could omit because that is the default anyways. But what does submitting a form mean now? It means that by default, the browser will construct a new HTTP request which is sent to the server that served this form. And without any extra configuration, that request will simply just be sent to your main server page, to your domain, so to say, and it will be a GET request. Now, what is a GET request, though? So, this is how the web generally works. When we enter a URL in the browser address bar, a request is sent to this backend server. So to the server which runs our Django application and which serves back those template files or these rendered HTML files based on our templates. And our server might also be talking to a database. That's how the web works. Now, when it comes to sending that request, though, we, on the client, we can define with our code that runs in the browser which kind of request that should be. And the default, in many cases, especially if we don't configure anything in our HTML code, is that a GET request is sent. And that's one of the supported request types we can set. A GET request simply means I want to get some resource. I want to get some data. Therefore, if you enter a URL in the address bar of your browser, that will always send a GET request to the server. And we can see this back on our basic template here, on our basic page with this form. If we open the developer tools which are built into the browser, in this case Chrome's developer tools, and we go to the network tab here, if we reload, we see all the requests which are being sent. And that's only one request for this one HTML file here in the end, for this page. Now, if we click on this request, we see the response which was sent back, which is just that HTML code. But if we click on headers here in Chrome, we see some metadata for this request. And here we see the URL to which the request was sent. But we also see the request method. And we see that here the request method was GET. So this is one of the supported request types. And as I just said, if you just enter a URL here and hit enter or reload on an existing page, it will always be GET. That's the default because you want to get this page. You want to get this data which is responsible for bringing this page to the screen. Now, if I click send here, a new request is sent also to the same URL, but with this question mark thing appended at the end, and it's also a GET request, as you can tell. So here again, a GET request is being sent. But where for visiting this page and for entering this URL for the first time, we are limited to a GET request, we can't change this there, we are not limited to a GET request when building our own forms. Here, we could change this. And we got a couple of alternative request types in theory, but with default HTML code as we're writing it without any JavaScript involved, there is just one main alternative, and that's a post request. A post request is the type of request you want to send when it's not primarily about getting back data, but if it's instead about submitting data to the server. So if you, that's a typical example, fetch user data in a form and you want to send this to a server, then you could send it as a GET request to imply that you mostly want to get some new data, but you typically would instead use a post request to make it clear that you collected some user data and you now want to submit that data to the server. Now, if you don't set it to a post request, and we will set it to one in a second, then as you saw, if I click send again, a GET request is sent by default. And for a GET request, the entered data in the form is added as so-called query parameters to your URL. That's this question mark thing. These are query parameters. It's data encoded in the URL. They are optional, but they always come after such a question mark if you add them. And then you simply add them as key value pairs with the key, equal sign, and then a possible value, like for example, max, which I can submit. Now that's our key value pair here. Now these are query parameters, and we could extract and read those on the server side as well. But as mentioned, you typically instead want to send a post request to make it really clear that you are submitting data, that this request is not primarily about getting data. And when you submit a form, of course, it's typically primarily about sending data. Hence, back in our code, we might want to change this form to send a post request. We want to tell the browser to send a post request instead of a GET request. Now, to send a post request here, we go to our form HTML element and we add an attribute here. To be precise, the method attribute. With that, we configure the HTTP method that should be used, and the default is GET, so we don't need to set this, but now we want to set this to post, which is the alternative. And this will then send a post request when this form is submitted. Now, if I save it like this, and we reload our page here, if I now enter Maximilian and I click send, you'll notice something interesting. Now I'm getting an error here, a CSRF error. I'll come back to that in a second. But if we have a look at the request which it tried to send, we see that the URL still contains the question mark, but only because I didn't clear it before. So if I do that, if I clear that URL and I click send, we see that indeed this is now not added, this question mark thing. And the request method is post now. And the data which is submitted is now no longer encoded in the URL with those query parameters. Instead, if we scroll down, there is this form data. A post request, unlike a GET request, can carry data. It has a so-called request body, which is an extra data package attached to your outgoing request, which contains data. In this case, this form data about the data we entered in the form, where we also have key value pairs with a key of username, because we picked username as a name on this input. Whatever you pick as a name here will be your key, and then the value entered by the user. And that data is now sent to the server where we can use it. But before we can use it, we need to fix this error, this CSRF error. Now, where's that coming from?